Hi, I'm Sabrina Drill. I'm the Natural Resources Advisor for UC Cooperative Extension for Los Angeles and Ventura counties, and I'm here today to talk to you about how to make Topanga a more fire-adapted community. Okay, now you can see that we're in this nice cleared hillside here. We've got, it looks like fairly dense vegetation around the house, but underneath there's been, again, separation created between the ground cover and the canopy layer there, and some separation between plant specimens. It might be a little bit dense. There are some pines that are close to the house, but they've been trimmed and limbed up nicely. I'd have to get closer to that tree to see the distance from the house itself. That might be a concern, especially with the window under there. That could be sort of an ember trap. One of the other things that's nice that she did is she maintained a lot of different species in here. And one of the neat things is, different native species are going to have different root characteristics. And you want really a variety of root distances to maintain a hill slope. If you have everything sort of ending at the same zone, even if it's deep rooted, you can create sort of a sheer area where the whole slope could fail. If you have a nice variety of species, they're going to have different root structures, and they're going to provide kind of a matrix under the ground to hang on to the slope. So we're about 300 feet from the structure. I'd say we're actually maybe 180 feet from the edge of the deck here. And what she's done is created this vertical and horizontal spacing between the vegetation that remains. Removed some things here, and that was done several years ago, which actually points out, this isn't something where you necessarily have to do everything every year. If you do it properly, you've maintained some specimens, you've created this sort of open gallery below, they're not going to grow up every single year. And part of that is because you've retained the shade. The shade that we see is going to retain some of the soil moisture, so that'll slow a fire down. Essentially, this whole spaced area is kind of acting as a vegetated fuel break. And then if we look at the trees themselves, either that one or this one, you can see where some limbs have been removed, but a lot of the vegetation remains. I see a few dead leaves here and there, but no real dead vegetation. So we've just decreased the overall volume while still retaining a healthy tree. And again, kind of creating this space, but still maintaining vegetation. So that's going to really hold this hillside together well in the rainy season. So there shouldn't be a lot of erosion issues. This is a native buckwheat here. They are fairly fire prone. They're great this distance from the house. Again, we're about 300 feet, a little more from the house right now. I wouldn't plant these in the first 30 feet around the house, or I'd remove them if they were there. So now we're right at the edge of her fire hazard reduction zone. And what the homeowner was telling us is that essentially this slope over here was as dense as this native chaparral vegetation over here. And it's neat to see the contrast, but it's also neat to realize there's no need to address this vegetation that's that far from a structure. In a fire situation where you've got an ember storm, embers can be coming from miles and miles away, and reducing the flame front this far from the structure would only decrease habitat values. So this is great. Keep this native vegetation when you are, the appropriate distance away from the home and structures, and this is providing wildlife habitat for native rabbits, wood rats, coyotes, bird species, quail might be in here, and that's great. Retain that stuff, kind of getting some balance with the natural community in the Santa Monicas. So here we're right at the edge where we have more of a maintained lawn that's going to be a nice fuel break area. and then more of her manicured gardened area. And some mulch here, and this is actually, you know, after you do a lot of this fuel reduction, you can retain a lot of the material on site and use it as mulch. You want to have the mulch layer be, you know, less than 5 inches. This might be a little bit thick. She was talking about getting them to spread it a little bit more. But there's no need to haul all of that material off if you can use it as mulch. And what the mulch is going to do is keep some of the weedy species from growing. And those weedy species could germinate after you do your fire hazard reduction, your fuel management. If you can keep those weeds down, you're going to be better come September, October, the really dry Santa Ana season. So now we're within this zone really, really near the house, where we have to start thinking about how anything that's fuel that's around the house could affect the structure itself. So one of the things that's really great that she's done here is we've got these stone patios, stone pavers, walkways all around the house. Nice, completely fire-resistant materials here. Some things that aren't so great, we've got vegetation actually growing right up under the eaves. It's on a metal trellis, which is great, so that's inflammable, but any of this vegetation, in fact, there's some dead stuff under here, this could catch embers, and then you're actually bringing a fire right to the structure. So that's not so great. I'd recommend moving that. She's actually got some firewood stacked right next to the house over here. You really want to move that firewood away from the house. Some other things that could be fuel in here, the woven doormats, and this patio furniture over here. But, you know, what's easy about that, you don't have to remove that. What's easy about it is you can just remove it when you know a fire is approaching. Although, you do have to be home to do that. So if you're going to go on vacation during fire season, you want to make sure to have all this done or have somebody who's going to come to your house and do it. So you can just take this stuff, bring it inside, throw it further from the house. She's got a pool over there. You could actually throw the furniture into the pool if you needed to. Same with the doormat, same with the firewood that's near the house. So now we're in the near home landscape zone, and you can see that she's got irrigation here. She's got efficient drip irrigation. That may or may not be what you need. It depends on the plant materials that you've chosen, what kind of irrigation you've got. One of the problems, though, to be aware of with drip irrigation is that it can attract wildlife who may chew through it, so you really need to maintain it. So anyway, she's ready to irrigate in this zone. Further down the slope, the plants over to the edge here are irrigated, and the plants in the middle are not. And one of the things that points out is she's chosen that butterfly bush. It's a plant that doesn't need a lot of water, maintains a high moisture content even in the dry season, and because she's not irrigating in that area, she doesn't have a lot of growth of weeds that then could die back in the dry season. So she saved herself some maintenance work in there. One of the things that we can see here, we're about 150 feet away from the structure, is there's a lot of vegetation at a low level. You can actually see it as you look up into the canopy over here. Those are ladder fuels, where they could bring a ground fire up into the high canopy. Now these are oaks, so they're fairly fire resistant, but still, it would be worse if these were pines, say. So what would be nice to do is kind of trim these lower branches, maybe thin even a little bit higher as well, so you get this vertical separation between the ground and the vegetation up above. And it kind of looks like they're working on it, so that's great. We've got a bin full of stuff they've trimmed back. You know, it's an ongoing project. It's something you need to keep working on throughout the season. So on this side of the house, they're definitely working on their fire hazard reduction. They've thinned out a lot of the vegetation in here, you know, mowed the grasses down, which of course everybody needs to do before the brush clearance fuel modification deadline. Some of the plants right here that they've used in their landscaping are nice. This is sticky monkey flower. This is a California native, very fire resistant, really pretty orange flowers in the spring. So I like to see that. So the vegetation they have in here is really nice. It's nicely spaced apart. It's a mix of California native plants and some non-native succulent and cactus species. And these are nice to use because, again, you're looking for plants that are going to retain high vegetation moisture with very little watering, because relying on watering during the dry season isn't really a good strategy in a fire-safe landscape, because you might not have access to water at that time. So one thing that's nice, you can see that the propane tank here is a really good distance away from the house. You definitely, in addition to the vegetation, you don't want other fuel sources, especially highly flammable gases, within the first 30 feet away from the structure. I wouldn't necessarily put a wooden shield in front of it either. You could paint it or put maybe sort of a metal fence or something away. I think they're just trying to visually hide it from the road, but there's no need to put this kind of wooden fuel right next to your propane tank. So we've walked a little closer to the house, and actually this vegetation really is too dense. And one of the problems you get, it's great to have low growing plants, but you can see there's ladder fuels going straight up here into some of the higher vegetation. That would bring a fire right up to be a crown fire with longer flame lengths. And the other problem that you have in here is when you get this kind of ground cover, you can get a layer of dead thatch underneath, so that even though it looks nice and green on the top, you've got fuels below, and that can even carry a fire underneath this green vegetation, and making it a little bit harder for firefighters to find the hot spots. So one of the things that's not so great in here, she's got a nice use of another really attractive California native, the Matilla hot poppy, in here, but it is a little dense, and it is right sort of leading up to this wooden deck. So what you don't want to do is bring a fire over under a wooden deck or under eaves of a house. So I'd thin back in here as well. And again, there's some vegetation. Now this is really, really moist vegetation, but still having it right under the deck is not a great idea. If you look up this hillside though, again, a really nice job of spreading things apart and limbing up some of the trees to break up that fuel ladder. So one of the things that really does need to be addressed in here is we have this jasmine vine growing right up next to the structure, even up over the deck. That would, it's not the most flammable plant, but still it could really bring a fire right in to the house. And even though you might be using fire resistant wood building materials, that's not something you want to test by bringing fire right up to them. So one of the things we've got here is she's using mulch. Mulch has its pros and cons. We've got some wood mulch here, which you can certainly use in a fire-resistant landscape, although I'd keep it away from the house a little bit more. She's also using some gravel mulch over here, which you can bring right up to the house. And one of the nice things that either kind of mulch is going to do for you is it's going to help to, again, retain soil moisture, retain sort of coolness in the soil. That's going to help break up a continuous fire front. And she's got kind of a slope down here that she's trying to retain. Mulch is going to help with that, and it's also going to help keep the weeds down so that you don't have as much work to do in terms of maintenance all the time. Also, she's got an example of using fire-resistant decking materials here. That's great. I'm not familiar with this particular composite material. One thing I do want to point out though is that just because it's composite material doesn't mean that it's fire resistant. You really want to look up the fire ratings. You can do that at the Office of the California State Fire Marshal for different materials. And there are wood choices too. Redwood is fairly fire resistant that you can use. So you can use wood or composite, but just don't think that because it's composite it's going to be fire resistant. One problem you get with deckings that have a lot of plastic materials in them is sometimes they can melt, catch on fire, and they're actually bringing little flaming drops down below your deck. So you got to be careful about that. A nice feature in here is they've got some firewood storage here away from the house. It's definitely 30 feet away from the house, so that's really nice. You want to make sure that if you're storing, again, flammable materials, furniture, wood, propane tanks, that you move them away from the house like this. So we've got this vegetation really going right up to the house. Ideally, you want a good 5 feet where there really isn't anything that could carry a flame to the house. We've actually got the tree fern here is contacting the house itself. So that's not great. You know, if you've put in the money for fire resistant building materials, but then you're just bringing fire right to them, you don't want to rely on that. The other thing is using the ivy here. The English ivy is a ground cover. This stuff is really hard to get rid of once you plant it. It is an invasive species. And even though it can look really nice and green on top, you get dead fuel material in here and it's really hard to get rid of this stuff. So it's something that I would just avoid bringing right up to the structure in these high fire risk zones. A lot of the tree choices in here aren't so great for this area. We've got a pepper, which is actually an invasive species, fairly fire prone, and hasn't really been trimmed up at all, produces a lot of flammable litter. Eucalyptus, the same story. You can see some of the litter that those are producing. It would be a lot better if this was a nice sort of native oak canopy in here. Also, you've got to watch if you're storing some materials. There's obviously some trees back there that didn't make it. You want to move back, and you know, anything that dies back, you want to make sure to move it away from structures. So one thing that's really nice in here actually is her use of some really low growing succulents as a ground cover. That's fine because again, we're talking about that separation between the crowns up here and the ground over here. There's a lot of pine needles in here and she's really going to need to watch because the jades in the back, they can get fairly big and they can kind of come up, but these aren't plants that are going to produce a lot of litter themselves on the ground, but they are sort of hiding these pine needles, so it's going to be a little harder to clear out. The pines themselves, they're fairly densely planted, so it is kind of well set up for a crown fire in here, and pines are extremely fire prone.